If you set your camera up using my custom birds and wildlife modifications to program mode, it will do just fine almost all the time. But one of the advantages of using program is that you do have a couple of options for those unusual circumstances, for those special challenges that digital photography offers and that birds in particular offer. One of the main problems with digital photography and with photography in general is that the human eye sees so much more than any camera sensor or film can record. For one thing, what they call the dynamic range of our eyes is much greater than any camera film, or digital sensor. We see brighter brights and darker darks. We see detail in dark parts of the scene that the camera just can't record. And we see detail in the bright parts of the scene that is beyond the capability of even the best of today's sensors to record. In order to deal with that, most camera makers have built in something called dynamic range optimization, or iContrast, or active D-lighting. These are all names for the same sort of process. What they do is, as the JPEG is being processed in the camera, they apply adjustments to the highlights and the shadows. In a sense, they try to tailor the response of the sensor to fit the full range of brightness that the human eye sees into the limited range that the sensor is capable of seeing. When we do this after the fact, it's called tone mapping. And you can get an idea of what I'm talking about by seeing how it's done in software afterwards. You take a good image of a bird and you make it better by decreasing the highlights and increasing the shadows, just like this. What you're trying to do is to bring detail up in the shadows and detail out in the highlights. Shadows are much easier to deal with. You can generally draw detail out of the shadows. Highlights you have to be very careful of, because once something goes pure white, the detail is simply gone and cannot be recovered. Dynamic range enhancement, or dynamic range optimization, or iContrast, or active D-lighting all take this same theory and apply it in camera while the JPEG is being processed. This gives you a head start in your processing after the fact in what you do on the computer, and gives you an easier image to work with. Here's some examples of the effect that can be achieved. This is a set of pictures from the Nikon P900. And you can see that the adjustments that are applied when you set it to active D-lighting, which I'll show you how to do in a moment, make for a better image with a better balance between highlights and shadows, and more detail in the shadows and more detail in the highlights. Now on the Nikon, it's easy to set up. In program mode, go to your menus, and I already have it on active D-lighting. Generally it starts out with image quality. So you have to scroll down until you find active D-lighting. Press the center button. I have it set to normal now. You can turn it off. And the first picture in the series was done with it in the off position. You set it on low or normal or even high. Normal is where I generally leave it. And you can see the effect that it produces in the examples that I put up here. Active D-lighting is what we might call a global setting. You set it once and it applies whenever the camera is in use. On the Sony, it's called DRO. It's Camera 1 menu on page 10. So there it is, Dynamic Range Optimization, or Auto HDR. Again, that's a global setting. Once it's set, it applies no matter what other changes you make to the camera. There is no reason not to set dynamic range optimization or iContrast or active delighting on any camera you own. It's only going to improve your images by pulling up detail in the shadows and pulling detail out of the highlights, increasing the overall dynamic or apparent dynamic range of the image. It's really just fitting the dynamic range that we see with our eye into the limited palette of the camera. Then too, there are situations that you will find yourself in the field where the dynamic range is just even beyond what the human eye can see. And I'm thinking mainly of birds against a bright background, birds against the sky. A blue sky is not so bad. Actually, a dull white overcast sky is the worst offender. If you get a bird against that, it is very difficult to get an acceptable image. Almost all cameras have what is called exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is such an important tool for the photographer that on my Sony here, they have a dial built right on the top of the camera that controls exposure compensation. As you can see, if you can see, it goes up to +3 and down to -3. You would use the plus side to bring more detail out of a shadowed silhouette. You would use the negative side to preserve detail in a brightly lit subject against a dark background. This is not something that you need to think about for every photograph you take. There are rare occasions when using the exposure compensation dial will get you an image that will be more satisfying than what you would have gotten without it. This is an image taken to demonstrate what happens when you use both. When you set the camera for dynamic range optimization and you use some exposure compensation. If we compare it to shots taken without any optimization and without any exposure compensation, you can see that using both gives you the best possible image in a difficult situation. So those are two of the ways that program gives you options for dealing with difficult lighting situations. You should use them both. I do turn on dynamic range optimization and just leave it on. Again, no good reason not to have it on. But exposure compensation should be used only as needed. And that is probably 1 out of 30 shots at the very most. Don't get in the habit of twiddling that dial for every shot. You're only going to make your pictures worse, not better in most situations. I should point out that even if you use exposure compensation and dynamic range optimization, you're still going to have to do some work in post-processing to get the best possible image. It's just that exposure compensation and dynamic range optimization may give you a better file to work with, so that when you're finished your processing, you come out with a more satisfying image. And you should realize that there are some shots that you just can't get. There are some shots where the shadows are just too deep, the highlights are already blown out, and there's just nothing you can do that's going to give you a really satisfying picture. In those situations, you just walk away and hope for a better day, or at least a better opportunity to come your way another day.